Hello, you. You're listening to A History of Italy. Episode 206, Isabella d'Este, the First Lady of the Renaissance.
E così ritorno su, lascio I colli nelle valli, tra due salici piangenti, io ritrovo la speranza di un amore che ormai fu.
So imagine you're sitting there at your desk and you grab a hold of your address book and start leafing through it. You see popes, emperors, including the illustrious Charles V, the Duke and Duchess of Milan, your sister-in-law, Lucrezia Borgia, Mummy and Daddy, the Dukes of Ferrara, Modena and Reggio Emilia, and you also have a few entries for artists that include Andrea Mantegna and Leonardo da Vinci. Now also imagine that you have managed to navigate the chaotic, violent and endlessly shifting political landscape of Renaissance Italy, a place where alliances changed with the seasons and even months. On top of that, let's say you had a chance to look back on your life as a ruler, patron, political operator, collector, propagandist, and cultural icon. You may not be the most beautiful woman of the age, and you may be carrying a few extra pounds, which is always better than not enough, but you are nevertheless the most admired figure of your age. You are the utmost authority on fashion, the Anna Winthorne of your day. If that sounds like you, then you are probably the Marchioness of Mantua, Isabella d'Este. Now, when people speak about powerful Renaissance women, names like Caterina Sforza or Lucrezia Borgia often come up first because they fit more neatly into dramatic storytelling. Poison, sieges, betrayals, scandal, revenge, all very dramatic. But Isabella d'Este was something different. She was not primarily remembered for military exploits or scandalous rumors, although plenty of rumors surrounded her too. Instead, Isabella became something perhaps even more influential. She became the model of the Renaissance noblewoman, cultured, intelligent, politically astute, and deeply aware of the power of image. In many ways, she was centuries ahead of her time, an influencer. She understood that prestige itself was power, and she cultivated it masterfully. Isabella was born in Ferrara in 1474 into the House of Este, one of the great ruling dynasties of northern Italy. Indeed, we know that a descendant of another branch of the ancient family moved to Germany and founded a dynasty that would eventually end up on the throne of a little place called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Ferrara at the time was one of the major cultural centers of the peninsula, a place of music, literature and art. Her father was Ercole I d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, and her mother, Eleonora of Naples, daughter of King Ferdinand of Naples, so Isabella grew up connected to some of the most powerful courts in Italy. But perhaps even more importantly, she grew up in an environment that valued education. This was unusual enough for boys in much of Europe who were still supposed to be better at sticking swords in people, blowing them to bits, and making babies. For girls, it was extraordinary. She studied Latin, Greek, history, music, dancing, and literature. She became an excellent conversationalist and a skilled musician, favoring the lute. Visitors to her court reportedly commented on her intelligence and wit. One of her contemporaries, Niccolò da Correggio, would call her the First Lady of the world, although his world was sort of limited to Ferrara and Venice. And all of this would become politically useful later. Because Renaissance courts were theatres, everything mattered. How you dressed, how you spoke, what paintings you commissioned, who you invited, what books you owned. Culture was not decoration, culture was politics. At the age of just 16, Isabella married Francesco Gonzaga, ruler of Mantua. Now, Mantua was much smaller than powers like Venice, Milan, or Florence, but it occupied an important strategic position in northern Italy, as we know, controlling the important waterway of the Po River, and the Gonzaga family were ambitious. The marriage itself was politically useful to both families, but unlike many noble marriages of the period, this one seems at least to have begun relatively positively. Indeed, the two had known each other for years, had played together, and when Isabella arrived in Mantua, she was moving to a familiar place. Francesco was a famous condottiero, a military commander for hire. He initially managed to create a pretty good reputation. We remember him, for example, as the victor of the Battle of Fornovo, which had been more of a draw, although French King Charles VIII had lost all the baggage train, which contained all of the booty from his campaign from the conquest of Naples, as well as his prized collection of pornography. In short, Francesco Gonzaga was better at PR and making himself look like a great military leader than actually being one. Furthermore, he was also deeply unfaithful. And not particularly discreet about it either, preferring to spend his time in the palaces outside Mantua where he could be with his lovers undisturbed. Still, Isabella adapted quickly to her new role, and she would eventually try to avoid getting intimate with her husband to avoid STDs. That doesn't mean she never showed signs of jealousy, such as when she had a servant's girl's head shaved for lying with her husband. Another woman Isabella was deeply jealous of was Lucrezia Borgia, with whom she had a rather complicated relationship. Now, Lucrezia married Isabella's brother, Alfonso d'Este, becoming Duchess of Ferrara. The first thing Isabella did when she found out they were to be married was to send spies to check out Lucrezia's clothes, jewels, and accessories. The two women could not have been more different in reputation. Lucrezia carried the scandalous aura of the Borgia family everywhere she went. Isabella represented artistic refinement and control, and would also try to represent this in the art she decorated her living quarters with, often depicting the tension between the earthly Venus of physical love and the heavenly Venus of virtue. The relationship between them became tense very quickly, partly because Isabella considered Lucrezia intellectually inferior, but also because Francesco Gonzaga reportedly had a love affair with Lucrezia. This certainly did not help matters, and Isabella never really forgave either of them. The two seemed to have code names for themselves, Barbara and Guido, and a go-between, Ercole Strozzi. When this messenger of the lovers ended up dead, possibly by order of Lucrezia's husband, Alfonso, then the lovers got the message and the relationship came to an end. Another woman Isabella was jealous of was her younger, prettier, and slimmer sister, Beatrice, who did not only have perceived physical advantages over Isabella, but she was also the Duchess of Milan, one of the 5 most powerful states in Italy at the time. What was even worse than that, where Isabella's first 2 children were girls, highly disappointing to a woman who had to squeeze out an heir as quickly as possible, Beatrice's first were boys. Isabella would also go on to have boys whom she doted on and adored, particularly her firstborn son, Federico, whom she addressed in one of her many letters as my soul. Speaking of letters, that is how we know so much about Isabella. She was an obsessive letter writer, and she has left behind over 30,000 pieces of correspondence. From these we can trace everything from political maneuverings to what clothes, cosmetics, and food for banquets she was ordering. In all of these letters, there is hardly any mention of her daughters, whom she practically ignored. Still, despite jealousies and personal resentment, Isabella maintained political pragmatism. That was one of her greatest strengths. Many noble women acted as regents while husbands were away at war, but Isabella did more than merely hold things together. She governed. When Francesco was absent, which was often, Isabella handled administration, diplomacy, and political correspondence, and she proved remarkably capable. Very quickly, ambassadors and rulers across Italy understood that dealing with Isabella was serious business. For those sad little people in the so-called manosphere who still declare in 2026 that women are too emotionally fragile and prone to physiology to be leaders, get this. One thing that Isabella would do to deal with said ambassadors was to surround herself with beautiful young maidens, whose attentions could be directed to the diplomats when needed to help Isabella get her way. In short, I would rely more happily on someone who's prone to emotion than one following one's penis, also known as penis politics. Meanwhile, Isabella was constructing something else, an image. She became one of the greatest art patrons in Europe. Now today we often think of art patronage as rich people buying paintings because they like them. But Renaissance patronage was about status and intellectual authority. What's more, artists could quite freely travel from court to court, keeping their ears and eyes open and becoming useful sources of information. And Isabella understood all that perfectly. She commissioned works from some of the greatest artists of the age. Leonardo da Vinci drew her portrait, although he never actually got round to painting it, something she would later complain to him about when trying to get him to do a portrait of her son, which he would also end up not doing. Titian painted her in later life, idealizing her appearance to make the aging Marchesa appear eternally youthful. This is the image that is most commonly associated with her. Her relationship with the established main artist of the court of Mantua, Andrea Mantegna, was a little bit more difficult, and she may even have smashed a portrait he made of her, since he was known to be characteristically unflattering. Her studiolo, a private study filled with carefully selected artworks and antiquities, became famous throughout Europe. Important visitors begged to see it, but not everyone was allowed, making visits to the studiolo and later another room on a lower floor known as the grotto an exclusive experience. And Isabella was extremely demanding. She knew exactly what she wanted. Artists frequently struggled to satisfy her expectations. She did not simply buy art, she curated identity. And perhaps nowhere was this more obvious than in her obsession with collecting. Isabella collected ancient statues, cameos, manuscripts, musical instruments, and exotic curiosities. Her agents searched Italy and beyond for rare pieces. Sometimes this bordered on the obsessive. She reportedly tried to acquire works she could not obtain, including pieces owned by powerful rivals. She would even purchase items that she could not afford, accruing quite a considerable amount of debt. At one point, she tried very hard to get a Leonardo painting after the artist had died. Going back to relationships, one fundamental thing that she understood was that personal feelings and political necessity were not the same thing. That ability would become crucial during the Italian wars, because while Isabella was building her cultural empire, Italy itself was collapsing into chaos. Mantua sat dangerously exposed in the middle of this storm. In 1509, disaster struck. Francesco Gonzaga was captured by Venetian forces during the War of the League of Cambrai. Suddenly, Isabella found herself effectively ruling Mantua alone during an extremely dangerous moment. And she excelled. She organized defenses, handled diplomacy, negotiated tirelessly, and managed to preserve the state. This was not symbolic leadership. This was real governance under pressure. Even enemies respected her abilities. One thing that extended the negotiations for the release of Francesco Gonzaga, keeping him in prison, was Isabella's refusal to give up her precious son as a hostage and a guarantee for her husband. The Venetians were also whispering in his ear, telling him that Isabella was stalling on purpose to increase her own power. Isabella held on, and eventually Francesco was released, but the marriage had deteriorated badly. The two increasingly lived separate emotional lives. Francesco's health also declined dramatically, likely due to his syphilis. Meanwhile, Isabella continued consolidating influence around herself and her children, and children mattered enormously. Dynasty was everything. Her son Federico would eventually become Duke of Mantua, not just Marquis. Another son, Ercole, became a cardinal. Through careful marriage alliances, Isabella connected the Gonzaga family to major European dynasties. Again, we see her long-term thinking. Not merely survival. Expansion of prestige, expansion of influence, expansion of legitimacy. Isabella continued on in her way after the death of her husband. As the 1520s came and rolled along, she did not spend all of her time in Mantua. Indeed, as well as her new hometown, she would go back home to Ferrara, Milan, and many other locations. In 1527, she found herself on a diplomatic mission to Rome to try and get a cardinal's hat for her son. As we know, in that year, a huge army of angry, unpaid Landsknechts came galumphing down and were headed for Rome herself. Isabella, despite the increasingly alarmed appeals from her son, was not going to leave the Eternal City until she had her way. In the end, she managed to convince Pope Clement VII, but it was too late to get out. This is where her organizational and diplomatic skills went into overdrive. She was staying in Palazzo Colonna, and as palaces, churches, and other buildings were sacked and burned, Isabella created a place of refuge in the city for those escaping the violence. She managed to negotiate with the captains of the horde, also paying a hefty sum, and Palazzo Colonna was one of the few to be spared. It further strengthened her reputation as one of the most capable figures in Italy. By this point, Isabella had become something larger than merely the Marchioness of Mantua. She had become an international celebrity. Princes sought her advice, artists sought her approval, writers praised her. Even fashion spread outward from her court. Hairstyles, clothing, and jewelry associated with Isabella became trends among European nobility. The Queen of Poland, Bona Sforza, said of her that Isabella d'Este is the source and origin of all the beautiful forms of Italy. She was effectively an influencer 500 years before social media. But of course, like all carefully constructed public images, reality was more complicated. Isabella could be manipulative, vain, and extremely calculating. She cared deeply about appearances. She could also be ruthless in pursuing family interests, and despite her reputation for sophistication, she could be intensely petty, particularly in the rivalries with other women. Still, perhaps that is precisely why she's so fascinating. She was not a symbol. She was a politician, an exceptionally talented one. And she operated in a world where women officially possessed very limited power. So she learned to exercise influence indirectly, culturally and dynastically, yet often with remarkable effectiveness. When her husband Francesco died in 1519, Isabella gained even greater freedom of action. She continued playing an active role in politics for decades, and unlike many Renaissance figures who faded after death, Isabella's reputation endured. Later generations look back on her as the embodiment of Renaissance courtly culture, the First Lady of the Renaissance, a title she still carries today. And in many ways she helped define what the Renaissance aristocracy wanted to be: cultured, classical, sophisticated, refined, powerful through taste as much as through force. But there is also an irony there, because while Isabella cultivated beauty, elegance, and humanist ideals, the Italy around her was increasingly dominated by foreign armies and brutal warfare. The Renaissance courts glittered magnificently, but beneath the glitter, the political independence of Italy was slipping away. And perhaps Isabella herself represents that contradiction better than anyone. One of the greatest cultural figures in Italian history, standing at the edge of Italy's political decline. Thank you very much for listening. A History of Italy is a Sentire Media podcast produced and hosted by me, Mike Corradi, and brought to you by my wonderful Tipeee, PayPal, and Patreon supporters, whom I'd like to thank starting from the first third of the Margherita Hack and Galileo Galilei level, and they are Alison H., Annie, Benjamin W., Carlston, Catherine C., Silane, Cindy M., Chris H., Cospia Fanboy, David M., Dean V., Demetrio M., Dennis K., Dennis S., Dominique T., Edward J., Edward S., Emily B., and Eric W. And of course, we can never, ever forget the tippy top Maria Montessori and Dante Alighieri level, Lisa K., Peter W., David L., David C., Sen, David A., Karen D., Bridget T., Dallas R., Joseph V., Stephen G., Julian, Howard, and up from the Margherita Hack and Galileo Galilei level, big thank you to Aurora, or Aurora, according to how you pronounce it. In Italian, it would be Aurora. If you'd just like to get in touch, which would be brilliant, hello@ahistoryofitaly.com or on Instagram or Facebook. Remember the request for contributions to the new section of the website if you have any article or contribution or family history that you would like to contribute to our unfolding story. Once again, thank you very, very much for listening, and until next time, arrivederci.